Paki, go back where you came from. The words hit 8-year-old Farrokh Bulsara like a physical blow, as he stood in the schoolyard of St. Peter's School in Panchangani, India. The group of older boys circled him, their faces twisted with the casual cruelty that children can inflict without understanding its lasting impact. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that this small, dark-skinned boy with the prominent teeth and quiet demeanor would one day command the attention of 80,000 people at Wembley Stadium, singing his name in unison. Hold that thought. Because what happened in those next 30 seconds would plant the seed of something extraordinary. Something that would eventually become the most powerful voice in rock history. The year was 1954, and Farrokh had just been enrolled at this prestigious British boarding school in the hill station of Panchangani. His parents, Bulmie and Jer Bulsara, were Parsi Zoroastrians who had moved to India from Iran generations ago. His father worked as a cashier for the British colonial government, a respectable position that afforded them certain privileges, including the ability to send their son to one of India's most elite institutions. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell Freddie Mercury's story: the daily humiliation that shaped the man who would become the most confident performer who ever lived. Your name sounds like a disease, sneered Marcus Wellington, the ringleader of the group. Farrokh? What kind of name is that? The other boys laughed and Farrokh felt his cheeks burn with shame. He wanted to explain that his name meant fortunate in Persian, that it carried the weight of ancient wisdom and proud heritage, but the words stuck in his throat. You see, what was happening to Farrokh wasn't just typical childhood bullying. This was systematic othering based on his ethnicity, his appearance, his very identity. And the psychological impact? It was about to create something unprecedented. Look at those teeth, another boy shouted, like a beaver. More laughter echoed across the courtyard. Farrokh instinctively covered his mouth with his hand, a gesture that would become habitual whenever he felt vulnerable. Those prominent front teeth, which his parents assured him gave character to his face, suddenly felt like a beacon advertising his difference to the world. But wait. Before I tell you what Farrokh did next, you need to understand something crucial about that moment, something that would explain everything about Freddie Mercury's later relationship with his audience, his desperate need for acceptance, and his absolute refusal to change his appearance even when fame could have afforded him any transformation he wanted. Mrs. Henderson, the school's music teacher, had been watching from her classroom window. She saw the circle of boys, heard the cruel laughter, and noticed something that would change everything. While most children would have run away crying or fought back or called for help, Farrokh did something completely unexpected. He started to sing. Not loudly, not defiantly, but quietly, almost to himself. It was a Persian lullaby his grandmother had taught him. A melody that connected him to something larger than the cruelty surrounding him. The boys stopped their taunting, confused by this strange response. Some began to drift away, uncomfortable with the beauty emerging from their victim's lips. Mrs. Henderson later wrote in her journal, which was discovered decades after her death. Today I witnessed something extraordinary. A small boy, being tormented for his differences, responded not with violence or tears, but with music. There was something otherworldly about his voice, even then. I knew I was looking at someone special. But here's the detail that will give you chills. Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one who noticed. Father O'Brien, the school's stern Irish priest who rarely showed emotion, had also stopped to listen. Years later he would tell anyone who would listen about the moment he heard the voice of an angel coming from a boy they called different. He said it was like hearing prophecy wrapped in melody. That evening, Farrokh sat alone in his dormitory, writing a letter to his parents that he would never send. The letter, found years later in an old school trunk, revealed the depth of his pain. Dear Mama and Papa, the boys here don't like my name or my face or the way I speak. They say I don't belong, but when I sing, something happens. I feel like I'm home, even when I'm not. What Farrokh didn't know was that his voice had already begun to create ripples throughout the school. Mrs. Henderson had spoken to Father O'Brien, who had mentioned it to the headmaster, who had made a note in the school records, a note that would change everything. Bulsara, F. Exceptional vocal ability. Recommend for school choir immediately. Now, you might think joining the choir would solve Farrokh's problems. That music would become his sanctuary, his escape from the daily torment. But you'd be wrong, because what happened next was even more challenging than the bullying. Success brought its own form of isolation. Within weeks of joining the choir, Farrokh's voice had become legendary throughout the school. Teachers would stop conversations to listen when he practiced. Visiting parents would ask specifically to hear the boy with the remarkable voice. But instead of earning him acceptance from his peers, his talent only served to make him more of an outsider. "Show off," they whispered. "Teacher's pet. Thinks he's better than us." The very gift that should have been his salvation became another reason for them to push him away. But here's what's remarkable about this part of his story. It was during this period of intense isolation that Farrokh began to develop something that would define Freddie Mercury for the rest of his life. An unshakable belief in the power of performance to transform reality. Every day after classes, Farrokh would retreat to the school's small music room and lose himself in song. But he wasn't just singing anymore. He was performing. He would imagine vast audiences, crowds of people who understood him, who celebrated his differences rather than mocking them. He would conduct imaginary orchestras, bow to imaginary applause, and most importantly, he would practice commanding attention rather than shrinking from it. Mrs. Henderson began staying after hours to work with him privately. She recognized that his voice was just the beginning. This child had an instinctive understanding of drama, of how to use his entire being to convey emotion. "Farrokh," she would tell him, "your voice is your superpower. But it's not just about the notes you can hit, it's about the stories you can tell. The feelings you can make people experience." But the real transformation began when Farrokh made a decision that would echo through rock history. He decided to stop hiding. It started small. Instead of covering his mouth when he smiled, he began to let his teeth show. Instead of whispering his name when introductions were required, he began to say it clearly, proudly. "Farrokh Bulsara," he would announce, letting each syllable ring with the dignity his grandmother had taught him it deserved. The bullying didn't stop immediately. If anything, it intensified for a while. Children can sense when their victim is refusing to remain victimized, and they often respond with increased cruelty. But something had changed in Farrokh. The shame was transforming into something else entirely. Defiance. One afternoon, during a particularly vicious taunting session, something happened that would become legend among those who witnessed it. Marcus Wellington, still the ringleader of the tormentors, had pushed things too far. He had grabbed Farrokh's books and thrown them into the muddy courtyard, then stood there laughing as the smaller boy knelt to collect his scattered possessions. "Look at him," Marcus sneered to his friends, "crawling around like the animal he is. Probably feels right at home in the dirt." That's when Farrokh stood up, muddy books in his arms, and did something that left everyone speechless. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a pleading smile, but a smile that seemed to say, "I know something you don't know." And then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Marcus, one day you're going to tell people you knew me when we were children. And you know what? I'm going to make sure you have something worth talking about." The confidence in his voice, the absolute certainty, was so unexpected that even the bullies stood there in stunned silence. But Farrokh wasn't finished. "Would you like to hear what I've been working on in music class?" Without waiting for an answer, he began to sing. Not the quiet, defensive singing of before, but full-voiced, powerful, commanding. He sang, "God Save the King," but he sang it like a prayer, like a promise, like a declaration of war against everyone who had ever tried to make him small. By the time he finished, a crowd had gathered. Not just students but teachers, kitchen staff, even the headmaster himself. And in that moment, something shifted in the social dynamics of St. Peter's School forever. The bullying didn't stop completely, but it changed. There was a new wariness in the way the other children approached Farrokh. They had seen something in him that day, something that suggested he might not always be the vulnerable target they had assumed him to be. But more importantly, Farrokh had seen something in himself. Mrs. Henderson later described that moment as the birth of a performer. She wrote, "It was as if he suddenly understood that his differences weren't weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be displayed." The voice was just the instrument. The real power was in his absolute refusal to be diminished. That night, Farrokh wrote another letter to his parents. This one, he actually sent. "Dear Mama and Papa, I have discovered something important. When people try to make you feel small, you must become larger. When they try to make you quiet, you must become louder. When they try to make you ordinary, you must become extraordinary. I am learning to use my voice not just to sing, but to claim space in the world." His parents, reading this letter in their small flat in Bombay, had no idea they were witnessing the first glimpse of the man who would become Freddie Mercury. But they could sense the change in their son's letters, a new confidence that both thrilled and worried them. The transformation continued throughout Farrokh's time at St. Peter's. By his final year, he had become something unprecedented in the school's history. A student who was simultaneously an outsider and a legend. He never quite fit in with the established social groups, but he had created his own gravitational pull. Students would gather to listen when he performed, even those who had once mocked him. But the most significant change was internal. Farrokh had learned that authenticity was more powerful than acceptance. He had discovered that refusing to change yourself to please others paradoxically makes you more magnetic, not less. Most importantly, he had realized that the very things that made him different, his ethnicity, his appearance, his dramatic sensibilities, were not flaws to be corrected but gifts to be cultivated. When graduation day arrived, Farrokh's performance of In the Sweet By and By left not a dry eye in the assembly hall. Parents who had never spoken to him approached afterward to tell him how moved they had been. Teachers who had initially seen him as just another foreign student now spoke of him as one of the most remarkable young people they had ever encountered. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Marcus Wellington, the boy who had led the early torments, approached Farrokh after the ceremony. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I was wrong about you. You're going to do amazing things, aren't you?" Farrokh looked at his former tormentor with that same mysterious smile he had worn in the courtyard years earlier. "Marcus," he said, "I'm going to do impossible things." As Farrokh left St. Peter's School for the last time, carrying his belongings and his hard-won confidence, he could never have imagined that this foundation of resilience built from rejection would eventually support the weight of global stardom. He couldn't have known that the skills he had developed to survive daily humiliation would translate perfectly to commanding stadium audiences. But Mrs. Henderson, watching from her classroom window as he walked away, somehow knew. She wrote in her final journal entry about him, "Today I said goodbye to Farrokh Bulsara. I have the strangest feeling that the next time I hear his name, the whole world will know it too." The journey from St. Peter's School to Bombay, and eventually to London, was about more than geographical distance. It was about a fundamental shift in how Farrokh saw himself and his place in the world. The boy who had once covered his mouth in shame was becoming someone who would use that same mouth to create some of the most powerful music in human history. But the path from Farrokh to Freddie wasn't straight or simple. It was filled with more rejection, more moments of doubt, more opportunities to either shrink back into safety or step forward into greatness. When Farrokh returned to his family in Bombay after graduation, his parents immediately noticed the change in their son. Bulsara later told friends, "He walked differently, spoke differently. It was as if school had taught him he was someone worth listening to." But Bombay, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, wasn't ready for someone like Farrokh. The city was caught between tradition and modernity, between Indian culture and British colonial influence, between the familiar and the revolutionary. For a young man who had learned to embrace his differences rather than hide them, it was simultaneously the perfect and the worst possible environment. Farrokh threw himself into music with an intensity that concerned his parents. While other young men his age were focusing on practical careers, engineering, medicine, business, Farrokh seemed obsessed with performance. He joined local bands, performed at school functions, and spent hours studying the records of Western artists who were just beginning to reach Indian shores. But it was during this period that Farrokh encountered a new form of discrimination, one that cut even deeper than the schoolyard bullying of his childhood. Musical elitism. The established music scene in Bombay was dominated by classical Indian traditions and Bollywood playback singers. Rock and roll was seen as Western corruption, unsuitable for serious musicians and certainly not appropriate for someone from a respectable Parsi family. When Farrokh auditioned for local bands, he was often turned away not because he lacked talent, but because his style was deemed too Western, too theatrical, too different. One particularly crushing rejection came from a prominent Bombay music producer who listened to Farrokh's audition and then said, "Young man, you have a powerful voice, but you're trying to be something you're not. Stick to your own culture. Stop trying to imitate the West." That night, Farrokh sat in his family's flat, staring at himself in the mirror. For a moment, just a moment, he considered whether everyone else might be right. Maybe he was trying to be something he wasn't. Maybe his dreams were too big, too foreign, Too impossible for someone like him. But then he remembered Mrs. Henderson's words. Your voice is your superpower. And he remembered the smile on his face when he had stood up to Marcus Wellington. Most importantly, he remembered the feeling of absolute rightness that came over him when he performed, regardless of what anyone else thought. The next morning, Farrokh made a decision that would change everything. He was going to London. Not just to visit, not just to explore, but to reinvent himself completely. He was going to shed every limitation that had been placed on him by birth, circumstance, and other people's expectations. He was going to become exactly who he was meant to be, regardless of the cost. The conversation with his parents was one of the most difficult of his life. Bomi and Farrokh Bulsara were loving parents, but they were also practical people who understood the risks their son was proposing to take. Leaving the safety of family and community to pursue an uncertain career in music, in a foreign country where he would once again be an outsider, seemed like madness. Beta, his mother said, using the affectionate term that always made him feel like a child again. What if it doesn't work? What if you fail? What will you have then? Farrokh's answer revealed how much he had grown since his days at St. Peter's School. Mama, he said, what if I succeed? What if I don't try and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been? I would rather fail at something impossible than succeed at something ordinary. His father, ever practical, tried a different approach. Son, you have opportunities here. You could have a good life, a secure life. Why risk everything for something so uncertain? But Farrokh had an answer for that too. Papa, I've learned something about myself. I'm not built for a good life or a secure life. I'm built for an extraordinary life, and extraordinary lives require extraordinary risks. The family spent weeks in intense discussion. Relatives were consulted, family friends offered opinions, and everyone seemed to have a reason why Farrokh should abandon his impossible dream. But something had changed in him during those years of building resilience against rejection. He had developed an unshakable core of self-belief that no amount of practical advice could erode. In 1964, at the age of 18, Farrokh Bulsara boarded a plane to London with 2 suitcases, a small amount of money, and a determination that had been forged in the fires of childhood discrimination. He was leaving behind not just his family and his homeland, but his entire identity as he had known it. The young man who stepped off that plane at Heathrow Airport was still Farrokh Bulsara, but he was already beginning the process of becoming someone else entirely. Someone who would take all the pain of being different and transform it into the most powerful stage presence in rock history. London in the mid-1960s was experiencing a cultural revolution. The Beatles had exploded onto the scene. The Rolling Stones were pushing boundaries, and young people everywhere were rejecting the conservative values of their parents' generation. For someone like Farrokh, who had always felt like an outsider, it seemed like the perfect time and place to reinvent himself. But London also presented new challenges. The immigration experience was humiliating in ways that brought back all the old feelings of shame and otherness. Officials processed him with the casual indifference reserved for colonial subjects, making it clear that despite his British education, he would always be considered foreign, temporary, provisional. Finding housing was even worse. Landlords would speak politely on the phone, but when Farrokh appeared in person with his dark skin and foreign name, rooms would suddenly become unavailable. Sorry, it's just been rented, became a phrase he heard so often it began to feel like a personal anthem of rejection. The discrimination was different from what he had experienced as a child, more subtle, more institutionalized, but no less damaging. It was the kind of racism that could make someone invisible, irrelevant, forgotten before they had a chance to prove their worth. But Farrokh had learned something crucial during his school years. Rejection could be transformed into fuel. He found a small room in a boarding house in Kensington, sharing space with other immigrants and struggling artists. His neighbors came from all over the former British Empire, India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, Africa, all of them trying to make something of themselves in a country that reminded them daily that they didn't quite belong. But instead of bonding over their shared experience of marginalization, something else happened. Farrokh began to see diversity as a source of creative power, rather than social weakness. His Pakistani neighbor introduced him to intricate rhythmic patterns that would later influence his music. His Jamaican flatmates shared the emerging sounds of reggae and ska. His African friends brought polyrhythmic complexity that would find its way into Queen's most ambitious compositions. Farrokh was absorbing everything, synthesizing influences from across the globe into something that was becoming uniquely his own. The discrimination that was meant to keep him on the margins was actually positioning him at the center of a cultural cross-pollination that would eventually revolutionize rock music. But first, he had to survive. Finding work was almost impossible. His British education counted for little when employers saw his face and heard his name. He took whatever jobs he could find, washing dishes, cleaning offices, loading trucks, work that was meant to be temporary, but seemed to stretch endlessly, as he struggled to gain any foothold in the music industry. The music scene in London was just as discriminatory as everything else, but in different ways. Club owners would listen politely to his demos, then explain that their audiences weren't ready for that kind of music. Producers would praise his voice while suggesting he tone down the theatrical elements. Other musicians would appreciate his talent while quietly questioning whether he had the right look for commercial success. The message was always the same: you're talented, but you're too different, too foreign, too much. Change yourself, and maybe we can work with you. By 1969, Farrokh had been in London for 5 years, working odd jobs and playing with various bands that never quite broke through. He was beginning to question whether everyone else might be right. Maybe he was deluding himself. Maybe his dreams were indeed too big for someone like him. That's when he met Brian May and Roger Taylor. The three young men connected immediately over their shared passion for music and their mutual frustration with the limitations of the London scene. But more importantly, they saw in each other something that the established industry had missed: the potential to create something entirely new. When they began rehearsing together, something magical happened. Farrokh's voice, which had been criticized as too operatic and too theatrical, suddenly found the perfect instrumental framework. Brian's innovative guitar work and Roger's powerful drumming created a sound that was ambitious enough to match Farrokh's vocal vision. But it was during these early rehearsal sessions that Farrokh made the decision that would complete his transformation. He was no longer going to be Farrokh Bulsara, the foreign student trying to fit into British society. He was going to become Freddie Mercury, a rock god who transcended all categories and limitations. The name change wasn't just about assimilation or commercial appeal. It was about claiming the right to reinvent himself completely, to become exactly who he was meant to be without reference to what others expected or accepted. Mercury came from the Roman messenger god, someone who could travel between worlds and deliver divine communications to mortals. Freddie was a name that felt both familiar and exotic, accessible but not ordinary. But the most important part of the transformation wasn't the name. It was the decision to stop apologizing for being different. The Freddie Mercury, who emerged in the early 1970s, was everything that Farrokh Bulsara had been told to hide or minimize. He was theatrical in a way that made other rock stars look conservative. He was ethnically ambiguous in a way that frustrated people who needed to categorize him. He was sexually fluid in a way that challenged conventional definitions of masculinity. Most importantly, he was unapologetically himself in a way that gave others permission to be unapologetically themselves. The early Queen performances were revelations not just because of the music, but because of what Freddie represented. Here was someone who had taken everything that made him different and transformed it into a source of power, rather than shame. His prominent teeth, which had been the source of childhood mockery, became part of his distinctive look. His ethnic ambiguity, which had made him an outsider in every community he entered, allowed him to appeal to audiences across racial and cultural lines. His theatrical sensibilities, which had been dismissed as inappropriate for rock music, helped create some of the most memorable performances in music history. But perhaps most importantly, his experience of being marginalized and discriminated against gave him a unique empathy for outsiders everywhere. Queen's music would eventually become anthems for anyone who had ever felt different, excluded, or misunderstood. The boy who had been told "go back where you came from" had used that rejection as motivation to claim the entire world as his stage. When Queen performed at Wembley Stadium in 1986, commanding the attention of 80,000 people and a global television audience of 1.9 billion, Freddie Mercury stood at the microphone representing something unprecedented in rock history. He was a Parsi Zoroastrian born in Zanzibar, educated in India, who had transformed himself into a British rock god while maintaining his essential difference. In that moment, every child who had ever been bullied for being different, every immigrant who had ever been told they didn't belong, every person who had ever been asked to minimize themselves to fit in, could see living proof that transformation was possible. The voice that commanded Wembley Stadium, was the same voice that had once sung quietly in a school courtyard to comfort himself during moments of cruelty. The confidence that radiated from the stage was built on a foundation of resilience that had been forged through years of systematic rejection. But most importantly, the man who stood before that massive audience was living proof that our greatest differences can become our greatest strengths, if we have the courage to claim them rather than hiding them. Freddie Mercury's story isn't just about musical success. It's about the fundamental human right to become who you truly are, regardless of what others think you should be. It's about the possibility of transforming discrimination into power, rejection into resilience, and difference into magic. When Freddie sang "We Are the Champions" at Wembley, he wasn't just celebrating Queen's musical achievements. He was celebrating every person who had ever refused to let others define their limitations. He was singing for everyone who had ever turned their pain into power, their exclusion into excellence, their otherness into greatness. The boy they had told to go back where you came from had not only stayed, he had claimed the whole world as his home.